What's up, everybody? Welcome into hour number 2 of a Friday edition of One Bills Live. The sun is out today. It's still freezing cold, but hopefully those temps move on up soon enough so Steve Tasker can get back on the golf course. We were talking about it earlier before we went on the show. I said, when are you going to start golfing? He said, that doesn't usually happen until the middle of April.
That's right.
That's soon
when we can
enough.
Count on it.
Soon enough.
Yeah.
Steve Tasker and Maddie Glab here giving you guys all the news because there's certainly a bunch today. And speaking of news, we'd like to welcome Tyler Brooke into the conversation. He's an NFL analyst for the 33rd team, and Tyler, we're just days away from the new league year beginning at 4 o'clock on March 12th, and we're seeing what teams are doing to become cap compliant. A lot of defensive linemen, a lot of pass rushers seem like they might be available for Buffalo if that's what you would deem as a position that Buffalo should go after. But as you are watching some of these things unfold and seeing these names that are hitting our timelines, is there anybody that you think Buffalo should go after that is now available that can get traded or has been released?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think the big reason why so many of these names are getting released is because of how deep the edge class is and the defensive line class in this 2025 draft. Obviously, the salary cap is going up. So, you have a little more resources to work with, but all these teams want to get younger in the trenches. That being said, I think it actually is a great time for the Buffalo Bills to be in the market for maybe an interior disruptor or a pass rusher. Von Miller won't play forever. You just need some more depth up there, as we saw with the Philadelphia Eagles. It's just important to always have as many pass rushers and interior defenders as you can. Trey Hendrickson's a name I think makes a lot of sense. He is looking for a new deal. I imagine that's a big reason why he wants to be traded. But obviously led the league in sacks last year. He's a bigger guy at 270 pounds. I think he is an extremely disruptive guy. And then just a new recent name that was just released by the Tennessee Titans, and Harold Landry is another guy I'd be keeping an eye out. Not as much production since his ACL injury in 2022, but definitely a guy I'd be keeping an eye out for.
And at 31 years old, Trey Hendrickson's cap hit's like 18 point something. What do you think is the going rate for a guy who's there? They said, okay, go get a trade. You got 1 year left. You'll save us $16 million on the cap if we trade you. What are we looking at as compensation for the Bengals in return for Trey Hendrickson, a guy who is massively important to their defense, even though their defense struggled?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. I actually just wrote an article about the kind of trade compensation teams might expect, or the Bengals might expect. Obviously, the fact that they're letting him have permission to seek a trade kind of hurts your leverage a little bit, but it's also that expiring contract, like you mentioned. It's significant cap savings for this year. You do not have to re-sign him. He is getting a bit older. So teams can really hang that over the Bengals' head. So for a team that wants to get in that market, like, hey, let's take a swing on a guy that we know will be at least productive for a couple more years. We know we got to extend him. We can use that to our advantage. I'm thinking probably a third-round pick, maybe a fourth. Obviously, that's just overall value. You can get a little more finicky with it if you want to exchange multiple draft picks, maybe even a player. But if we're just going a straight pick for a player, I have about a third-round value there.
Right. We're talking about the defensive line, and you said that this is going to be a deep class for defensive linemen in the draft, and this is why we're seeing a lot of teams decide to release some defensive linemen that were due some big-time salaries in the 2025 season. When you look at Buffalo and what they're missing and how close they are every single season, how do you weigh going after a veteran who could maybe produce right now versus a defensive lineman who could be available at number 30 for Buffalo?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I really think that 30 spot is kind of the sweet spot for a lot of value in the draft, right? There are guys like, I'm thinking Kenneth Grant, a defensive tackle out of Michigan, or Tyleik Williams, another D tackle at Ohio State. And then there's some of these, fringe second tier of edge rushers like Donovan Ezeraku, Princely Uman-Mielen. If I'm in that situation, I think I'm taking the swing in free agency more on a corner at the top of this corner class in free agency, going after an edge in the draft or a defensive lineman, trying to stack up in the trenches, and just really hoping I can find that swing in free agency in the secondary.
All right, so you brought it up. Give us a name. Give us a corner. There's going to be some dudes out there. There always is. And certainly there might be even names in the next few days that we didn't expect to be on the market.
Yeah, a name I love that I've done a lot of homework on lately is Paulson Adebo out of the New Orleans Saints. Broke his leg in the middle of the year. So, there were some questions about his health. He's all over social media right now doing backflips and posting stuff on the treadmill going 21 miles an hour. So clearly this leg is fine. But if you look at his production over the last few seasons, interceptions, tons of pass breakups, he's sticky in man coverage. I really like his skill set. So if you're not going after a corner, which I imagine we'll talk about in a little bit, in the draft, and you want to go after free agency, he's at the top of my board, honestly. I am a huge fan of Adebo. I think he's really being slept on in this free agent class.
All right, a name to keep an eye on, somebody that I'm going to go look into right after we do this interview.
I wrote that down.
You wrote it down.
Yeah.
Got to remember this for later. Well, you had a mock draft that came out, a 7-round mock for Buffalo. I want to go through that. Round 1, 30th overall, you have the Bills taking a cornerback, Siobhan Revel, out of East Carolina. Why does that player fit in Buffalo's scheme?
Yeah, so I'll give the caveat that this is all pre-combine stuff, right, with that 7-round mock draft.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I wrote this was right after the Bills are eliminated. What's fresh in mind is, injuries in the secondary and how exposed the secondary was because of that lack of depth there. I think it's important that when you're playing Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs every year that you load up on that secondary. So Siobhan Revel is a guy I really like, tore his ACL earlier in the year, but when you watch his tape from beginning of this year and in 2023, man, you're getting a 6'2", 6'3" corner with length, super sticky in coverage. And I'm always very partial to the cornerbacks that aren't afraid to get a little, their nose dirty, right? Very competitive, very physical, not afraid to help and run support. It's a guy I think brings a lot of length, ball skills, explosiveness, and again, that tenacity that I just love that makes me think he's still a first-round pick, even with the ACL injury. I had not gotten any info from how he did it, medical evaluations at the combine, but I imagine with an ACL, he should be ready to go by the beginning of the year.
Yeah, an ACL is not the career ender it was decades ago. I mean, those guys, it's a little bit more of a hiccup as well. But let's other guys you've got the Bills taking like 56 because the first 3 picks I think are crucial. Obviously the 30th pick, but 56 and 62 very close. 56 you've got them taking Xavier Watts, who's a safety out of Notre Dame, who's been highly touted.
Yeah. I mean, 13 interceptions in 2 seasons is pretty incredible, right? Like ball skills everywhere. He's super explosive, instinctive. I love the way he can sometimes bait quarterbacks and make the wrong decision. And in an NFL league right now where there's not a lot of single high safeties, I think he can fill that role. I know I've covered the Packers for a lot, and I always think of Xavier McKinney in that single high role being able to, clean up and come away with all these turnovers. That's the kind of guy you're looking at Watts. And then you look at how he's developed over the past season. His run support is drastically improved. He is super aggressive. He has that length to trip up guys, but he's not going for the trip ups. He's trying to knock your head off. And I really appreciate that from a safety that really is that ball hawking kind of free safety guy.
Tyler Brooke of the 33rd team is on with us right now. And then later in the second round, going through your latest mock draft that you had come out in February before the NFL scouting combine, you have the Bills selecting a defensive lineman, Omar Norman Lott out of Tennessee. Why is he a talented defensive lineman in this year's group?
Yeah, obviously, there's probably 25, 30 defensive linemen in this class. And of all the guys I watched, I'm honestly a fan of all of them. That's how good this class is. But when I turned on the tape on Omar Norman Lott, very stout against the run. He does a great job of getting extended and disengaging, which is super valuable in run defense. He also brings quite a bit of juice as a pass rusher. He's got a couple moves in his bag for an interior defender. His motor is off the charts. I really like his upper body strength. And I honestly think if they got him that late in round 2, I think that's an absolute steal. I'm a huge fan of this kid.
All right, so let's get. I didn't want to go down through all 7 picks, but because we don't even know because compensatory picks haven't been decided on, so we don't know exactly where the Bills are picking after this. I want to ask you about this Myles Garrett thing. Certainly, the ownership turning down the meeting with him is the big story of the day. And it looks like both sides, both Myles and the Browns, are digging in. The Browns do not want to let this generational guy out the door. He wants out the door and is willing to sit out, apparently, to make it happen. What's it going to take for the Browns to let him go? What's the compensation in that draft pick? And what's it going to take to get him back in the door if the Browns do want to keep him?
Man, that second part of that question is a lot harder to answer, I think.
Yeah.
What I've appreciated about him, especially when guys request trades, I think he has been extremely transparent about what he wants, what he's looking for. And it is straight up to, I want to compete for a Super Bowl, which is why the Bills make a lot of sense for as a target. But someone's going to need to offer up a heck of a lot. This is going to probably go into training camp, I imagine. I don't think it's going to be a good situation. It's clearly not about the money for Myles. But at the same time, the Browns need to get something in return to, give up what is likely a first ballot Hall of Famer who's still in the prime of his career. I mean, this is a sensational pass rusher we're talking about. So for someone to take him, I'm imagining it's at least a first round pick. And I'm usually one of those guys that likes to shy away from, giving away such premium draft capital. But this is Myles Garrett we're talking about. This is one of the best football players at any position in the NFL, and a guy that can really upgrade and bolster a defense. So I'm imagining premium assets. As far as what it's going to take to keep him in the building, I would just imagine that it requires some significant swings by the Browns to show that they want to be a contender. But with how the resources are tied up right now, I just don't see a path forward for that happening.
Yeah, the Browns are still dealing with that Deshaun Watson contract that happened years ago, but everybody still talks about it because Watson is still due quite a bit of money there. You spoke about a first-round pick maybe being the compensation for Myles Garrett. Speaking of first-round picks, we heard what Seattle is seeking in a trade for Myles Garrett, a first and
DK.
a third. Sorry, DK Metcalf, a first and a third, and DK also wants big-time money. Do you see something like that happening? It's a big ask, but I guess Seattle's owner came out and said, hey, we're talking to several teams right now.
I think this might drag out a little bit longer because from what I would guess is that Seattle's not hearing the compensation that they want to hear as far as the DK return. You can make an argument. Let's say I'm trying to trade for DK Metcalf and I want to try and undersell his value. He's a little bit of a distraction, right? He can get some unsportsmanlike penalties, things like that. He has a new contract coming up. There are factors where I don't think they're getting first round compensation. I don't think anyone's probably even asked for that. More realistically, I'm imagining that it's a third round pick plus a little something. I'm not saying that's a first. I'm not saying that's even a second. Maybe it's another day 3 pick. Maybe it's even another player. There have been reports about the Green Bay Packers potentially interested in a DK trade, and instead of giving up, premium draft capital, it might be a day 2 pick plus one of their young receivers who's on a rookie deal. It's a very interesting situation because, he's a very rare type of receiver, right? He is a big-bodied dude that can take the top over a defense, and also just have body control, contested catches. There's just not many receivers built like DK Metcalf, which is why I can understand why Seattle wants so much in draft compensation. But at the same time, I just don't think they're going to get the return they're hoping for.
Right. I mean, he's had 66 catches the last 2 years, both the exact same number of catches. But he has had 1,000 yards. He averages over 1,000 yards per season. And you're right. He does bring something to the table that that a lot of teams really want if they don't have it. A big, physical, number one type receiver who can really, really run. There is a market for him, right? And
yes.
And so and if the price comes down, isn't it true that even more teams will start to pick up the phone and say, well, if that's the case, then instead of being a handful of teams, it's going to be 2 handfuls of teams, right?
Yeah, I mean, because you got to think about it. Teams that are going after him want him because of his unique play style, right? And there's just simply no one like his play style in the draft. There's maybe a day 3 option like Dante Thornton Jr. out of Tennessee, who's a height, weight, speed guy, but obviously completely unproven. He did not play a lot for the Volunteers last season. And then outside of him, there's some big-bodied guys. They do not bring the juice that DK Metcalf brings. So if that asking price goes down, if you're one of the 31 other teams that doesn't have a DK Metcalf, you have to be awfully attentive to at least pick up the phone.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. You said you're an Indy guy. The scouting combine happens in Indy now that we're about a week removed from the NFL scouting combine. What were some of your biggest takeaways from the combine?
I mean, one kid that I was just blown away with at the podium was Jahdae Barron, the cornerback out of Texas, which could theoretically be a Bills target at 30. I mean, this kid was incredibly instinctive for the Longhorns. He's played corner, slot, safety over his extensive career at Texas. But just his podium, you can just tell that this kid lives, eats, breathes football, just incredibly high IQ. Blown away by that more than the athletic testing. And sometimes for us looking on the outside, trying to look in, it's kind kind of hard to get that feel for prospects, but that podium alone just blew me away. I think he'd actually be a pretty nice target for the Bills. But the guy that everyone wanted to talk about was Shamar Stewart, a guy that was a 290-pound edge rusher at Texas A&M. And the whole argument is, well, he doesn't have a lot of production for the Aggies, right? 4.5 sacks over 3 seasons. He had one of the most historic combines for any edge rusher ever. He dropped, over 20 pounds. He went from 290 to 267, and then posts something like a 41-inch vertical. Just insane testing all over the boards. I don't have the numbers right with me, but I mean, after blowing away at the Senior Bowl and then just testing as well as he did, and extremely charismatic guy on the podium. I had seen him as a potential pick in the 20s. I think he's pushing top 15, maybe even top 10, because there's just not a lot of guys outside of Myles Garrett that have tested athletically as well as Stewart did at his size.
What is the word on why he was so unproductive? I mean, I watched some his film.
He ran a 4.59.
Yeah,
he's looked it up.
You're right. He's unbelievable. I mean, sometimes you get the idea that they'd be almost better off not trying to block him. He doesn't seem to be that instinctive. Sometimes he runs up the field and he's not where the ball is. You know what I'm saying? What is the idea? What is the word about how NFL teams view his lack of production with all those measurables?
So, I haven't talked to a lot of coaches about Mike Elko's scheme. It is very creative. It is very different, and they like to be very multiple, right? So, because Nick Scorton also transferred from Purdue and was the other edge rusher at Texas A&M. Both of these guys were really bulked up and cut significant weight at the combine. It almost seemed like they wanted them intentionally big to kind of mush rush, contain pockets against dual threat quarterbacks to prevent them from escaping, and then helping against the run. That seemed to be more of the priority, was pressures and run stopping over actual sacks and production. Maybe that's an Elko philosophy. It did seem like it when I was watching on tape, because, I watched Nick Scorton at Purdue, and that kid, I think, double-digit sacks for the Boilermakers, comes not nearly as productive at Texas A&M from a sack standpoint. I just imagine that's a defensive scheme standpoint. And I did want to touch on your note about him flying upfield a lot. I totally agree with you. It's something I see early in games. But what I think is my favorite trait about Shamar Stewart, if you watch a game front to back, he learns and he adjusts as he makes mistakes or things aren't going his way. He changes his plan of attack, and that is a huge testament to his mental toughness, in my opinion, and another reason why I'm personally so high on him.
All right, Tyler, thank you so much for the time, giving us a little bit of insight to some of these guys that were at the scouting combine, as well as some insight into maybe some players who Buffalo could be interested in with a couple of their first picks, 1 in the first round, 2 in the second round. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.